Yo lo que quiero vacilar, la, la. Yo lo que quiero vacilar, la, la. Yo lo que quiero vacilar, la, la. Yo lo que quiero vacilar. Yo te lo digo que aquí traigo gozón, que muchos hablan pero quieren gozón, porque ellos saben que yo tengo gozón y se vacilan este rico gozón, gong, gong. Yo lo que quiero es vacilar, la, la. Yo lo que quiero.
I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to Conversations with Al McFarlane. Glad to be here and glad to have you along. Kind of a gloomy, dreary Tuesday, a little wet, but at least it's not very, very cold. And at least we know that warm weather is on the way. So hooray for the future warm weather. Pleased to have today a friend, a colleague, a compatriot, a companion, Jonathan Palmer. Jonathan Palmer is the Executive Director of Hallie Q Community Center in St. Paul, and I've asked Jonathan to hang out with me for the hour, talk about whatever's on his mind, and I have things on my mind that we can always share and exchange. If you want to be a part of the conversation, drop me a link. My email is al@Insight News. I'll watch that. Or if you're tuning in via social media, I'll put up the URL, and you can come into our conversation at StreamYard. I'll post that momentarily. People are listening live on KFAI here in Twin Cities, but also live on kfai.org around the world. They're also connecting with us through the social media channels of Black Press USA, the National Newspaper Publishers Association, and their YouTube channel and their Facebook page. People are also connecting with us through the Insight News social channels. They include our Twitter account, they include our Insight Facebook, and they include our, what else? I think those are the main ones, Insight, Facebook, and our YouTube channel. So if you are with us, however you're with us, we appreciate you. We thank you for being a part of this conversation, part of this work. We want to always ask you and remind you to support the great work at KFAI by becoming a member, renewing your membership, making a gift. We've come through a pledge period, but we're always open to your support, your comments, your feedback. So, Jonathan Palmer, how you doing, man? Good to see you. Good to hear you.
I am doing pretty good, Al. It's great to be here. Always enjoy having a conversation with you.
It's always wonderful to talk with you. I wanted to think, Jonathan, about the fact that you and I both went to Morehouse College in Atlanta. And yesterday, I think, marked the anniversary of the death of Dr. Martin Luther King. And have you done anything personally or in your reading or, convening in community or church that reflected on who and what King represented in his life and our mutual connection with him through Morehouse College?
Yes, and I think it's always a piece that those of us who went to Morehouse remember, think about, and fondly. And it's a sobering time to remember Dr. King and think about his legacy and the impact that he had. My class, the class of 91, actually does a weekly Zoom call. Spell House, we call ourselves, Spellman and Morehouse. And so alumni from the class of 91 get together. We start on Friday and it goes through the weekend, and just anybody can pop in. And so every time we do that, there's topics of discussion. So we talked about it a little bit this past weekend. It'll talk a little bit more this weekend, but it's really good to reflect back on the lessons, especially looking at what's happening in the world today and looking at the impact of Dr. King's words and legacy. It's atrocious when I see people trying to twist that around. I've seen conservatives try to use the words of Dr. King in the wrong way to justify, actions when we're talking about things like critical race theory and, well, Dr. King said to judge people. Yes, Dr. King did say that, but here's the context. They're always missing the context. You can't go ahead and just take a quote and say, hey, this is what somebody said, and it matches up perfectly, because it's not what they meant and it's not what it applies to. So.
His work to me, Jonathan, was important. And it's important, as you say, that we not allow anyone or ourselves reduce his work to 2 or 3 sound bites, that the body of his work spoke to the pathway to full self-realization for all of humanity, beyond borders, beyond race, beyond other limiting definitions, but toward the elevation of a human and global connectedness, shared responsibility, shared access to resources and opportunity. And so I think it's important that we study the words of Dr. King and study his book. I have a piece that I'm going to read. I haven't read it yet. I've got a class I'm going to take that examines uh, uh, his books. But I think that we should do more of that. So let me move on then. And thanks for that.
Can I jump in with one thing before we move on? Because there's another piece that I think is often overlooked. And it is a part of Dr. King's legacy. What Dr. King also did was he removed the threat of terrorism on the Black community. Before, the civil rights movement, a lot of people don't understand this. In the last, I call 2020 the year that America figured out racism still exists. Because suddenly people discovered Tulsa, and it was because of the show Watchmen, because people saw the opening and they were like, oh my, this didn't really happen. Yes, it actually did. And then they discovered Juneteenth and all the things that have been around. And people don't realize that before the civil rights movement, an African American could just be grabbed up by a white person. Just grab you out your house, kill you, and that would be it. There would be no consequence. The juries were all white, the judges were all white and racist. We got to put that in because not all white people are bad. My father's not bad. But the whole thing is the fear was there for our community because there was no protections, there was nothing to happen. And so the movement itself and the work of Dr. King removed that in large part because of the fact you started getting protections of the law. So the legacy of terrorism that we had been living under before the civil rights movement, before Dr. King's work, went away in large part. There's still things that happen, but there's a lot more protections within the law. So I want to make sure to note that because it was an important piece.
I'm going to share on my screen share some of the titles of his work. Let's see. And I don't know if you've read any of these, but if you have, you can say so. What I'm going to read is, let's see, the one book called Why We Can't Wait and Where Do We Go From Here? Those are the two that are on my reading list right now. I don't know if you can see that on your screen, Jonathan, or not.
I got to take off the glasses. So I've reached that age finally, Al, where I'm nearsighted. So I got to take off the glasses to really. I've read a lot of his speeches. So the I Have a Dream, of course, Letter from a Birmingham Jail. The one that I just ordered actually was Measure of a Man. So I haven't started that yet, but I'm looking forward to read that. But everything he wrote, everything he spoke about was so prolific and so profound.
I was part of a study group, and because I haven't been able to keep up with the actual reading assignment, but they closed last night in narrative. Dr. Greg Carr from Howard University and Karen Hunter, who's a radio personality, Dr. Karen Hunter, and journalist as well, have been conducting a study group called, I think it's called, what's the right name for it? But it's a group that almost 1,000 people come to discuss different books, and the book they were reading that they ended up reading, finished last night was I think, Where Do We Go From Here? And the lecture last night, I didn't listen to it, I missed it last night, but what they were going to discuss last night was the revolutionary content that King was way ahead of his time and really challenged foreign policy, challenged systems of deceit and systems that were uh, intended to maintain a form of control over people while espousing democracy, uh, systems that would make real democracy unattainable. So anyway, I think it's worth getting the books if you haven't, if you can, and studying Dr. King and knowing more. And it's important that we all do the work, that we
Yes.
read and we have our conversations among us and between us about our heroes and about the people that helped shape the identity, the ideas, what we say is progress for our people. I'm Al McFarlane, talking with Jonathan Palmer. Jonathan Palmer is the executive director of Hallie Q Community Center in St. Paul. It's located in the MLK Center over on Kent, 270 North Kent Street in St. Paul. And Hallie Q is a legacy institution. And Jonathan, I wanted you to take a minute to talk about what Hallie Q Community Center is today, how it originated. It's got a history that's phenomenal, and it's part of a national movement. They call it the Settlement House Movement. So if you would take a few minutes to walk through what the center does now, but how it came to be, and what its ongoing overarching mission has been over the years.
Thank you, Al. And so the Settlement House movement were places like ours that, as people were coming from different parts of the country, as they were coming into a city, they could connect to settlement houses, and it would help them find housing. It would help them find jobs. It's the early social service agency. And you have a lot that happened around the turn of the century in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We were founded in 1929. And our early group comes from the fact that there were a lot of issues going on, but there was no place that African Americans could actually gather, connect into resources, touch on that here in St. Paul. The YWCA had tried to do a quote unquote colored branch, and it did not work at all. So what you had was a group come together, and it was the St. Paul Urban League. It was the St. Paul chapter of the NAACP. It was a number of churches, community leaders, all formed this committee to create our organization. And so in 1929, they came to that. They also had an essay contest to name the center. So the reason why we're named for Hallie Quinn Brown, who's one of those hidden figures of history, is that there was an essay contest. Herbert Howell, who was a Hamlin student, wrote about her and her impact. Most people don't know about her, just like they didn't know about Catherine, just like they didn't know about so many other figures in history. And there's a great bio on our website, but this woman at the turn of the 20th century was traveling around Europe and America talking about women's suffrage issues, talking about civil rights issues. She spoke before the 1924 Republican National Convention. That was, a lot of African Americans were part of the Republican Party in the early part of the 20th century, because it was still the party of Lincoln at that point. But that was the first and got the right to vote. So you think of an African American woman addressing the national body. She had tea with Queen Victoria after a command performance, represented the United States at the International Congress of Women in 1897, started the National Association of Colored Women's Club. And most people don't know about her because there's no Lifetime original movie or action figure or thing like that. We get into this piece a lot of times, I joke, in history, where people think Black history started with slavery. Sometime later, Martin Luther King was born. Then Barack Obama became president. Nothing else happened, with that. Turns out there's a lot more that happened, as they're discovering with Juneteenth, with Tulsa, things. And Hallie is one of those who was a contemporary of Ida B. Wells. Her and Ida, worked together. And Ida was aligned with W.E.B. Du Bois. And so you have that same kind of tension that the two of them had, but also still working for the good of the community. So our center has been here in the Rondo community 93 years, serving as the lighthouse of the community, anchoring in. We do early childhood education, youth enrichment, basic needs, which is our food shelf and clothing closet, and connecting people to other resources. If we don't do it, we know somebody who does. So we work with a lot of our partner agencies, and then senior programs, and then multi-service center administration, fancy $15 word for bringing other programs in. One of the shining jewels of our center is we have a historical archive here at the center, chronicling the history of the Rondo community, chronicling the history of African Americans here in Minnesota.
The Hallie Q Brown, I consider it sort of in a league with its sister organization in Minneapolis, Phyllis Wheatley Community Center. And I view Phyllis Wheatley and Hallie Q Brown as sort of defining anchors for the development of our community. I add to the two of you a newer organization in South Minneapolis, the Sabathani Community Center. And between the three, you kind of represent and anchor the three primarily African-American neighborhoods in Twin Cities. The challenges that you faced over the past 2 years as COVID affected everybody and everything in our community, in our country. What have you done? How have you navigated and continued to serve the community during the COVID pandemic and crisis? And what do you see? What have you learned about how you have to be able to pivot from time to time, to reinvent and to reassess the value that you bring to the people that you serve? What's been your experience over the past 2 years?
The past 2 years have been very challenging. And one of the things that I think often goes unnoticed with the entire nonprofit community is how much work we do, because we're not out there doing it for the attention or the fame. When the pandemic hit, the governor asked organizations like ours to stay open as essential service agencies. So ourselves, the ones you mentioned, Phyllis Wheatley, Sabathani, over here we've got Keystone and Neighborhood House and Merrick. There's a whole bunch that all stayed open to provide the resources. Our food shelf was one of the big ones, and then our education for providing children of essential workers and families who couldn't afford to stay home. A lot of times people don't think about that piece, where there are some families where they just could not stay home with their kids. And so we actually were providing distance learning classroom pods here at Hallie Q Brown before that really became a thing. But the biggest thing was actually the food. So you have March of 2020, organizations like ours are asked to stay open, but there's no resources. And that's not a fault of anybody. It's a matter of pandemic caught everybody off guard. Nobody knew quite what to do. And we had this demand coming in. So what we did, which was a little bit different, a lot of food shelves had to go to a pre-packed box that they were able to get and just kind of get out so people could get resources. But we felt that a pre-packed box was not going to meet the needs if you had dietary restrictions, if you had religious needs, if there was just things that you needed specifically. So we innovated and created an online order form so that people could go right to our website, and this is still up. They can still do it this way. Just check off what it is that you need. So we were able to maintain client choice. Our staff then calls and follows up and checks on both the list of food. We also have done household items, PPE, things like that during the pandemic, and checking in just to make sure people are okay. Do they need other resources and things along those lines? So with that, we were then able to set up so that times where people could pick up, or if it was in the local area, we could do some delivery. And what we saw was a 4,000% increase in new clients. We had 108 sign up in March. We had 1,808 sign up in June.
Wow.
And the overall thing was this being able to provide people with what they want. We had people coming in from Rochester, from Lakeville, from St. Louis Park because either their food shelf had closed or the pre-packed box would not give them what they needed. And even though the pandemic has decreased a lot, hasn't gone away, we've kept a lot of those people as members of the clients. One of the great things that food shelves did, all the competition went out the window. All the lines of this is my area, all that went out the window. We banded together and just said, we will serve whoever shows up. And we connect each other to our different food shelves. If they're not in our area, we'll say, you're welcome to come here, but here's the one that's closest to you. We were trading food. Any food shelf that got extra food would call up, Prison would call us, so we've got a whole pallet of milk. Do you guys want this? We worked with Hy-Vee. Hy-Vee came through very strong for us. And we got about 11 tractor trailers of food that they had filled and brought in a bunch of our partner agencies like the ones I've mentioned, North Point as well, and others, so that each one was able to get a tractor trailer full of food. And that helped to go ahead and sustain, communities that suddenly, you couldn't go to work, you weren't getting paid, you don't know what to do.
Right.
So helping people to navigate it. And we also had it, if they didn't have access to the internet, they could call us if they showed up at our doors. The building has been closed to the public, but we would go out and meet with them and we can just run through a checklist. So we made sure that people had food. We made sure that kids could continue to learn. We did a lot of working with them, helping them connect online, but also then teaching with them right here in our classrooms. And so it was my team. I have a phenomenal team here who worked really hard. We had members of our board coming in to volunteer. And a lot of us pivoted over to keep focusing on that. So we never laid off anybody. We kept all together. And then we did a lot of stuff internally to make sure we didn't get too burnt out. We would do like lunches, like for the first, I think 3 or 4 months, we just did lunch every day. Provided lunch for all of our staff. Some of our board members even sponsor that. We went ahead and tried to do some fun things, created some competitions and things to keep going up. We took care of, as we got to the holidays, we had all of our staff write a letter to Santa, and then we went ahead and just got them what they needed. So we banded together as family. We made sure that our staff was taken care of. We made sure our community was taken care of. When we got to the vaccinations, we did several vaccine clinics here. We vaccinated over 1,000 people.
Wow.
That gave us the opportunity to make sure that our seniors got vaccinated, our food shelf clients, our families in our early learning center. So we've been here all during the pandemic, never closed. Well, we closed. We had one time that we did close. We had one case of COVID that showed up, but it wasn't here at the center. It was one of our staff got it at home. We just closed for the precaution. There was no transmission, but we did have 1 week where we had to close about that. Other than that, we were open the entire time.
That's great. What have you learned? What will you be doing? What will community centers do differently in the future? And where are you now? Are you more open for the kind of in-person activity that you used to have? What's your status on that continuum right now?
So one of the things we learned was, one, partnering is the best way to go. 2, helping people understand a little bit more about what we do. A lot of people didn't realize, like when they first were doing the quarantines and they were creating the special exemptions for who could be out, we weren't included. And so we had to lobby the state to go ahead and say, hey, we're part of the things. You're having us be the safety net. People are thanking doctors and baggage clerks and all that, and they forgot that food shelves are doing the same kind of thing.
Right.
Once we got into that, so the governor's office was really helpful. The governor and lieutenant governor had come out here a couple times. Migdalia over in there was really helpful in making sure that food shelves and organizations like ours got included in some of the legislation so that things would happen. And then as resources started to come, Those came from both the government and the foundation community and individuals. People started to really come together and support. So the best thing about this was community. People coming together in community, people, doing food drives on their own, coming over. And we then helped smaller organizations who didn't have the capacity. We had a number of churches, a number of small organizations who couldn't do and gather food or store food or things like that. So we would give out pallets each week and help them to help the congregation. And that's what community is. We come together, especially the Black community, to come together, help one another, and move forward with that. What we're kind of retaining is one, the online order form. We've had people have really appreciated it. They've said it's like having a personal shopper because our staff will pack up the food for them, get everything they want. We've checked with them to see if they have any special needs. Food shelves, it's a lot of you get what you get. We try especially to source culturally specific foods. That's one of our big things. And with that, if we've got Skippy peanut butter and somebody likes Skippy peanut butter, we'll put that in if they mention that. But it's a lot of going ahead and tying into that. One of the biggest things that come out of this has been some of the work we've been doing in anti-racism awareness and understanding the context of how we've got here. I've been going into organizations over the past 2 years, doing trainings for their board, doing presentations to their body, talking about the history of racism in the country, talking about what Juneteenth is, what Rondo is, how this all arrived at this point. Because there's a lot of people who they didn't realize how deep the racism went. When you're talking about the murder of George Floyd, and when you're talking about in the middle of the trial, you have Dante getting killed. You have all these incidences that come up that people looking for answers, they're looking to try to understand the context of this, and they don't realize how much of this is woven into our society and the fabric of America from its early starts. That's not that America's a bad place, but we've got some things that need to be cleaned up and cleared up. And the first thing you got to do is you got to expose that to the light. You got to let people see what is ingrained in our society when you're talking about, higher increases for certain drugs in terms of consequences, when you're talking about the availability of resources within a community, when you look at the Community Reinvestment Act data from banks and how much money is actually going back into the community. I think Spike Moss had the whole Fair Share campaign talking about that. The ideas that go, or even what's being taught in school. The big buzz thing right now is critical race theory. And you have people in communities across the country and conservative legislators who are out there and talking about they're not going to teach critical race theory in my school. We're not going to have it in the district. And you know what? They're absolutely right. Because they're not teaching critical race.
They never have. Yeah.
Unless you're in grad school.
Right.
It is a graduate level framework. You got to be in law school or grad school. So that was a fun talking point that they were assigning, not to actual critical race theory, but actual history that was being taught that cast a light on things that have happened in our country that have been covered over. Tulsa, Red Summer, the Summer of Soul, in terms of positive things that people don't even realize. When you look at here in the Rondo community, the idea of putting the highway right through the middle of the Black community under the terms of cleaning up the slums and going ahead and doing things at that measure, when there was another route that it should have gone on that would have gone along the industrial tracks, would not have gone ahead and disrupted the community. When you look at the fact that they didn't just demolish homes, they made people clean their homes before they demolished them. I mean, that is the kind of degradation that goes with that. And then the nice homes, they didn't demolish. They picked them up, moved them a few blocks over, sold them to a white family, and now there's things. There were people who went in and stole stuff out of the homes, workmen who took stained glass and fixtures. They really went through the community, and for lack of a better term, they raped that community.
Yeah.
Rondo was destroyed not because of progress, but because of racism. And in fact, Chris Coleman was mayor in one of his last years as mayor, issued an apology on behalf of the city and on behalf of the mayor's office, named it as racism. He said this is racism, plain and simple, and put money in his budget for the Rondo Commemorative Plaza. And the Rondo Commemorative Plaza this has happened in like over 2,000 communities across the U.S. Rondo Commemorative Plaza is the first monument to this kind of destruction of urban design that has been used in Black and brown communities across the country.
I'm Al McFarlane. You're listening to Conversations with Al McFarlane. My guest, Jonathan Palmer. Jonathan Palmer is the Executive Director of Hallie Q Community Center in St. Paul. Like me, he's a product of Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. And like me, an activist in our community, a person committed to sharing information, shedding light, being an advocate, a teacher, a teller of truth as we see it, as we've experienced it, and a person willing to discuss, take on the disinformation, misinformation that allows our society to cloak itself with the veil of ignorance as it destroys people in general, our people in particular. To that we say no more and never again, never again. Jonathan, I was going to ask you about several things. One is the Rondo. Tell me again the year that the Rondo destruction happened. I must have been 64, 65, or 60s. Do you remember?
Right in there. And it happened throughout the 60s because it took a little while for them to build the highway. Right. So they took out Rondo Avenue. They took out the homes that were in the highway, but they also took out homes, businesses, and places that weren't even in the path of the highway. Our organization, our original home was an African-American union hall. It was a group of Masons, Oddfellows, and others that had come together. They weren't getting access at white union halls, and they said, you know what, we're just going to build our own. They built it in 1913, had a mortgage burning ceremony in 1923, and it was a part of the community. We moved in about 6 months after we started, tail end of 29, beginning of 1930. We soon took over so much programming space, they sold the building to us. So that is our first home. And it was one of the casualties of the highway in the sense that we were not even in the path of the highway, but the amenities for people coming off the highway. You go to our original location right now, it is a curb cut for a strip mall parking lot so that people could come off the highway and buy food and other stuff like that. And so you think about legacy institution built by African Americans and paid off, by African Americans so they could own their own, and that getting destroyed within this process so that there could be quote unquote progress. It's not about progress. It's about going ahead and destroying communities of color every time we get to a point of organizing. Every time we get to a point, Rondo was the place that people came to. Rondo was the place that the civic leaders came from. If you look at the photos of the Pullman porters and red caps, which is one of the few good jobs, good for us, that could be gotten at that point, those people are the ones that founded the NAACP, that founded the Urban League, that founded Hallie Q Brown, the Sterling Club, the Credifarm Club. All these pieces came out of this community, and they decided that rather than figure out another way, and there was already a route, rather than do that, let's just put it through. We don't care about African Americans. We have members in our senior group. We have the Magnificent Golden Agers and the Retired Men's Club. We have members in those groups that have to walk by the homes they grew up in that were stolen from them during the Rondo highway destruction. And if you talk to any of them, we had some guests from another institution that were talking with them about how they lost their homes. And they were very clear. No, we didn't lose our homes. This wasn't an accident. Our homes were stolen away from us. And that's an important distinction that people often forget. Nobody lost anything. These were homes that they owned. These were homes that were here in the community. These were connections. They were taken through eminent domain intentionally to destroy the political and economic power that was here in the community in order to create something different. And we've got a movement going on right now, which is really good, with Reconnect Rondo, looking towards creating this cultural district that connects organizations like ours, Aurora St. Anthony, the Rondo Center, all of these coming together to really connect back in the community. And there's a proposal for a lid over the highway that would have businesses, that would have housing, that would really establish a piece to go ahead and focus on this. And actually, what was interesting was yesterday, we got a message about this, that Republicans in the legislature had introduced a bill specifically to block funding of this. And Keith Baker was over there, so I haven't even had a chance to talk to him. I don't know how successful his efforts are, but it was fascinating that anybody would create a bill that specifically says you can't put money to this, that the legislator can't allocate the funds that had been selected and allocated for this, when this is going ahead to restore some of that vitality, to really go ahead and connect the community back and be a linking point for all the organizations that are here. For, you're looking at Walker West, you're looking at Hallie Q Brown, you're looking at Aurora St. Anthony, you're looking at our code, you're looking at, Reconnect Rondo, all these organizations that can come together, help businesses thrive, help organizations thrive, help the community to thrive. So why anybody would stand in the way of that is beyond me, other than, let's call it racism. I can't say that I'm not going to name anybody specific, but there is no good reason not to be supporting these efforts. If there's issues with the plan, then you get together and you work out those issues. You talk through that. You don't just flat out oppose it.
And so the call to action is for our listeners here at Cafe I and those who are connecting with us via our Facebook and YouTube pages to raise questions, to call the legislature and tell them that you support the Reconnect Rondo initiative. I don't know if you can see on your screen, Jonathan. I pull up the web page there.
Yep.
And walk us through that again. Some of those items, you've mentioned them, but say them again just because it's important to say it.
Well, Reconnect Rondo has been working to actually build that kind of connection back to the community. You have some wonderful people and great elders in the community. Mary Kay Boyd is on their board. Nathaniel Kalik is on their board. Marvin Anderson. Marvin also went to Morehouse. So Marvin, being one of those pieces, you have this coming through. Creating this lid and this plaza that would go over the highway is just one step. The land bridge can be a method for connecting around that, hoping to get people engaged. But with that will be the opportunity that you have for new businesses, for new housing, for green space that people can connect over, and for something for the community to rally around and connect over, and a little bit of making up for what was done in the past. It's a very small, when you consider over 400 years of oppression, when you consider millions, 22, I think we're at, for dying during slavery, and the impact of that, and how many of those just on the Middle Passage coming over. When you look at how much our country has been built upon the backs and the labor and the economics of all people of color. But I tend to talk about African Americans because that's where my knowledge is. So I don't want to exclude anybody, but when I'm talking specifically about the impact of slavery, the economic impact, and the groups, the companies the foundational pieces for wealth that has been built on the backs of Black and brown people that isn't acknowledged yet. We're working towards that, but understanding that people who talk about I did it myself often did not. Oftentimes they've inherited wealth from their generation before them or their grandparents or whoever it is. And most of that, I can't say most, a large part of that came from quote unquote free labor of slavery, where we were only considered 3/5 of a person. So, how does that even matter? All throughout our history, you can look at every single aspect and see where we have been at the center point, and the exploitation of us has been at the central point to help establish economic wealth for white people. And when we talk about things like reparations, when we're talking about things like fair share, when we're talking about these people think of it as it's some sort of a handout, or I don't have anything to do with it. I never owned slaves. My family didn't own slaves. And they're missing the point of the roads that you drive on, the farms that exist, the ones that have been in families for generation. Those are the legacy pieces that come from our labors and our community's labors. So it is not about, did you personally own slaves? It's about how your family has been able to go ahead and prosper economically. If you look at, and I know I'm going all over the place, but that's where this goes to. When you go into the fact of redlining and the development of that and the GI Bill and who was eligible for that and the components of looking at the earliest part, when the FHA loans came out, and you look at, I think it was, I want to say it's 120 billion, and less than 2% of that went to non-whites. We're talking about the shift that we had from the old, it used to be you have to put half of your house down, half the amount down, and pay the rest off in 5 years.
Right.
So you had GIs coming back, you had families who weren't able to own. So they created the FHA loans so that families could do the 30-year mortgages, but they weren't approving them for African Americans. They weren't allowing them in certain areas. The places they would approve them the most for people of color, inner city. Inner city means you get an apartment or something small. You can't build wealth off of that if you're not getting the resource. But the suburbs,
Land,
which
space,
were largely all white, yes, you get that. Edina was a sundown town. I mean, for people not aware, sundown towns were places that you could not be brown and be after dark. You would get killed. That just plain and simple as that. There are covenants in a lot of cities. They're looking through the ones. There's a project looking at the ones in Minneapolis. Edina had them. Other cities had them, where you were not allowed to own a home.
Let me show you this book, Jonathan. You might not be aware of it. I'll hold up Whiteness in Plain View. Are you familiar with this yet?
No, that
It's
is
a
going to
book
be
recently published by Minnesota Historical Society Press. The author is Chad Montrese, a professor in history at University of Massachusetts Lowell. He's the author of 4 books, but this book says Minnesota is a paradox. The name of the book again is Whiteness in Plain View. Let me read just a paragraph off of the back of it, because it says and affirms exactly what you're saying. It says Whiteness in Plain View examines the ways white residents across Minnesota acted to intimidate, control, remove, and keep out African Americans over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. Their methods ranged from anonymous threats, vandalism, and mob violence to restrictive housing covenants, realtor deceit, and mortgage discrimination, and they were aided by local, state, and federal government agencies, as well as openly complicit public officials. What they did was not an anomaly or aberration in some particular place or passing moment, but rather common and continuous. chapter by chapter of the book shows that Minnesota's overwhelming whiteness is neither accidental nor incidental, and that racial exclusion's legacy is very much woven into the state's contemporary politics, economy, and culture. That says it all. It's a hellified summation, but that sort of explains what you described as the indignity that our community is experiencing right now in the legislature. If, as you said, there's some debate about whether or not restoration should occur for the residents of Rondo, and the approval of the initiatives brought from within our community to move towards restoration and healing. And so, again, this is important that we discuss it. That's the most important thing.
Yes.
Let me shift for the, well, you want to
I
comment
just
on that
ordered
first
the
of
book
all?
while you were talking. I just
Yeah.
ordered my copy. So thank you for that.
Good. Yeah, I think, and what I'll do, maybe I'll reach out to the Historical Society to arrange a interview with the author. And if I do, I can put together members of Rondo and members of North Minneapolis whose neighborhoods were affected by this policy. And that would be a great conversation to have. Let's plan to do that. I'll do that. Jonathan, I want to acknowledge too that you're going to be writing a column for Inside News covering at least several things, but open to do whatever you want to do with it. But I've asked you to talk from your position of leadership at the Hallie Q Brown Community Center, but also talk about your personal journey. One of the things you talk about is the center's capability and desire to help our community look after itself, to be healthy. That's something personal for you. You've been posting on your social media kind of a journal of your experiences as you've come through medical challenges, and talk about that to the degree that you want to. I'm hoping that you'll share your journey through the column in Inside News. I tell people, for example, that I'm experiencing and have been diagnosed with prostate cancer. Haven't had to do surgery yet, but it may have to come in the future. My diagnosis and prognosis is wait and watch. At this point in time, doctors saying that my experience is something that people likely die with rather than die from. I guess that's encouraging, So, and then I've gone through a process of congestive heart failure, right? And so those two things I'm living with, and making myself pay attention to the need to think and be thoughtful about health maintenance. And so you've come through some things like that too. What can you tell people, and what do you want to tell people, Black men in particular, about how we have to address our health?
And that is one of the things that we have to do is adjust the health. I want to talk about two things, I think, right now, and I'll get into more later. But the first one is depression. And I actually wrote a piece called Living with Depression. I don't say I'm suffering from, I say I live with it. And I had been diagnosed, I've been treated for it, I've gone through the things, but depression and mental illness is one of those things that nobody likes to talk about. We're getting more open now, but especially within the Black community, and especially with people who look at the Black community, because this notion of, well, you don't have a job, you don't have a home, you don't have a family. What do you have to be depressed about? You don't have any of those things that would cause, and you're like, that's kind of the point. And
that's why I'm depressed.
Live in fear, yes, and we could get shot at any point. We don't know about, how that goes. So one of the things I've tried to do is one, be open about that, because we have to remove that stigma of talking about mental health, mental illness. NAMI is a really great organization that works at that, but we've got great community centers like Open Cities, North Point, that really work and help people. So first and foremost, I want to put that out there, because
let me respond to that too, because I do this all the time. I tell people that I'm so fortunate in my own mind that I have the insurance and the wherewithal to afford mental health care as well, that I have a regular session every Thursday with my therapist. And my objective is to be introspective, to examine me and to examine how I feel, how I think, and what things are barriers that are internal, which ones are external, and how I navigate all of it to become the best human being I can be. And the most important thing in talking about this is to share with other Black people in general, Black men in particular, that we deserve to be healthy. We deserve to be healed and to be healers. And we should not shrink away from or let stigma keep us from examining the processes we need to become healthy in our minds and body. So go ahead. Got about 3 minutes left, Jonathan.
Okay. So the other big thing is, and I've left it open on my social media, so anybody can go to my Facebook and read this. But in September of 2021, I was re-diagnosed with cancer. In 2012, I had testicular cancer, dealt with it surgically. We thought it was over. 10 years is usually when they declare you over. 9 years was last year. So, and when it returns, it comes back in other parts. So mine actually came back in my chest. I had a baseball-sized tumor that was wrapped partially around my thoracic aorta. And if we had not caught that, a doctor told me, it would have killed me in 3 months.
Wow.
So it would have encircled my aorta, cut off the flow of blood, and one day I would have just dropped dead. Mm-hmm. So I jumped right into chemotherapy right then. I did an intensive regimen of 3 months. I had my community come. My Spellhouse family did a meal train for me. My fellow nonprofit friends were bringing over food, doing chores. My Hallie, my team rallied around me, and just anytime I was feeling down from the chemo and the fatigue, they were there. I have come through it. They did a post-cancer scan in January. That 8-centimeter mass had shrunk down to 8 millimeters. So baseball down to the size of a button on the shirt, for context. And now I've got 5 years of monitoring. I'm dealing with the after effects, which are horrible as well. So I've got neuropathy and things, but I'm not dead, which is a good thing. And so I will take numbness and tingling and pain over dead. Mm-hmm. And so I've tried to share the journey so that people can understand this is what we go through. And I've had so many people who have said, my father went through this or my mother went through this, but they would never talk about it.
Right.
So this helps me understand.
Amazing. Listen, we're out of time. This has been a beginning, so I'm going to have you back regularly, Jonathan, as often as you are able to come back. I told you that we've got a group on Thursdays that normally includes our friend Youssef and includes sometimes Tyrone, Terrell, sometimes Peter Hayden, and some Angela Rose Myers, mm-hmm. Irma McLaurin, you know her, I think, from Your Rock. Good group of people, and we just kick it. So Brenda Lyle Gray, who you met earlier, is on that call as well. Listen, thank you so much, and thank you for sharing all that you've shared. Thank you for all that you do in community. We appreciate you. I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. Thank you for listening, for being here. And now we pass it back to the station at KFAI. Thank you.
Can I say one quick thing?
Yes, you can. Go ahead.
I want to say right now we're www.hallieqbrown.org. We're tail end of the March campaign, so it's the biggest thing for our food shelf. We also are doing a ham giveaway on Monday, so you can sign up if you need a ham. We got about 200 to give away.
Wow, there we go. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Let me go back to KFAI. Are you there, KFAI?
Thank you, Al.
Okay,
thank you, Al McFarlane, for conversations that matter to communities that matter, both locally and globally. You are listening to